Long before the galaxy was scarred by betrayal and civil war, there was an age remembered in the chronicles of the Imperium as a time of boundless momentum. It was an era when humanity stepped outward into the darkness between the stars with certainty rather than fear, guided by a singular will that few could truly comprehend. In those distant centuries, the Imperium was still young, its foundation still hardening, its borders still uncertain. This was the age of the Great Crusade. Across the vastness of the galaxy, expeditionary fleets moved like migrating constellations. Thousands of warships carried soldiers, explorers, engineers, and diplomats from one newly rediscovered world to another. Some planets had remained loyal to humanity during the long isolation of Old Night. Others had drifted into strange cultures or forgotten their origins entirely. The Crusade sought them all. Its purpose was simple in declaration, yet immense in execution. Humanity would be reunited. From the core ward systems to the dim spiral arms of the galaxy, the fleets traveled without rest. Their banners bore the twin-headed eagle, a symbol of dominion and unity. Their commanders carried the authority of terror itself. And behind all of it, distant and largely unseen, stood the figure whose will had ignited this immense endeavor, the Emperor of mankind. To most citizens of the Imperium, the Emperor was less a ruler than a distant certainty, an unshakable presence whose guidance shaped every decision, but whose physical form remained far removed from ordinary life. His voice was not heard in the marketplaces of newly compliant worlds, nor in the quiet corridors of frontier settlements. Instead, his authority traveled through legions of commanders, through vast bureaucracies, and through the mighty fleets that bore his vision into the void. In the earliest days of the Crusade, this distance only strengthened the aura surrounding him. The Emperor was spoken of in tones reserved for figures of myth. Some imagined him as a warrior who had personally conquered terror during its final wars. Others believed him to be a philosopher king who understood the secret rhythms of history itself. Whatever the truth of his nature, the results of his leadership were undeniable. Humanity, once shattered into countless isolated fragments during the long darkness of the Age of Strife, was rising again. The stars that had once seemed impossibly distant were now connected by the strange pathways of the warp. Through these shifting currents of unreality, the Imperium ships traveled faster than light, guided by the psychic beacon that shone from Terra. Navigators studied its signal as sailors once studied the North Star, trusting its steady brilliance to guide them through storms that existed beyond the laws of normal space. It was a dangerous method of travel, but it was the only one that allowed a civilization to stretch across the galaxy. And so the Crusade advanced. Each fleet carried with it the might of the legions of Astartes, warriors created through arcane genetic science, larger and stronger than ordinary humans, forged specifically for the brutal task of conquering hostile worlds. Their armor gleamed like moving statues of war, and their presence alone could decide the fate of entire planetary governments. Where diplomacy succeeded, the Imperium welcomed its lost children with solemn ceremony. Where diplomacy failed, the Astartes advanced. Yet the Great Crusade was not simply a campaign of conquest. In the record preserved by imperial historians, one finds a consistent theme repeated across thousands of compliance reports. Again and again, expeditionary fleets encountered worlds that had survived the long isolation in extraordinary ways. Some civilizations had preserved fragments of ancient knowledge, maintaining technologies that the wider Imperium had only recently rediscovered. Others had regressed into feudal societies where knights in crude armor ruled over scattered populations. There were planets where humanity had adapted to strange environments, developing customs and beliefs shaped by alien skies and unfamiliar suns. Each world added another thread to the expanding tapestry of human civilization. For those who lived during this age, the momentum of the Crusade seemed unstoppable. Victory followed victory. Systems that had once been silent now transmitted messages of loyalty to Terra. Supply lines grew stronger. New shipyards were constructed in orbit around compliant worlds. Entire generations were born into a civilization that seemed destined to dominate the galaxy once more. Among the commanders of the Crusade fleets, a quiet confidence took root. They believed they were living in the beginning of humanity's greatest era. Yet even during this age of triumph, there were moments when the scale of the galaxy reminded the Imperium that its knowledge remained incomplete. The stars were ancient beyond comprehension. Long before humanity had built its first cities, countless other civilizations had risen and fallen. Their ruins lay scattered across forgotten planets, buried beneath layers of dust and ice. Expeditionary fleets occasionally discovered such relics. Sometimes they were little more than crumbling stone monuments, worn smooth by millions of years. At other times, there were vast structures orbiting dead stars, their creators long vanished, their purpose impossible to decipher. These discoveries fascinated the scholars and archivists who traveled with the Crusade. But they also carried a quiet implication. The galaxy was older than humanity's dreams of conquest, and not all of its secrets had yet been revealed. Still, the Crusade pressed forward. At the forefront of many fleets were the Primarchs, legendary figures created by the Emperor himself. Each was a commander of extraordinary intellect and strength, a master of warfare capable of leading entire armies with effortless precision. To the soldiers who followed them, the Primarchs seemed almost mythological. Their presence inspired loyalty beyond reason. Their victories became stories told across dozens of worlds. Where a Primarch's fleet arrived, compliance often followed swiftly. Together, these leaders and their legions pushed the Imperium's borders ever farther outward. New routes through the warp were charted. Unknown regions of space were mapped. Entire sectors that had been silent since the Age of Strife were brought back into the fold of human civilization. For many within the Imperium, this expansion appeared to confirm a comforting belief that humanity's destiny among the stars had finally been secured. Yet the galaxy has never been a place of simple certainties. Even during the earliest triumphs of the Crusade, subtle anomalies began appearing in the reports carried back to Terra. Most were small details, easily overlooked within the vast machinery of imperial administration. A lost expedition whose final transmission hinted at something strange discovered on a distant moon. An archaeotech structure that defied conventional understanding. A world whose ancient ruins suggested the presence of forces long vanished from the galaxy. Individually, these reports meant little. Together, they formed faint echoes of a larger mystery. But during the early years of the Crusade, few had the time or the inclination to dwell upon such possibilities. The Imperium was expanding too rapidly. New systems demanded attention. Wars of compliance required careful coordination. There was always another frontier waiting beyond the edge of the latest star charts. And so the fleets continued their journeys through the silent darkness between suns. On Terra itself, the Emperor remained largely unseen by the populations of the growing Imperium. His attention was divided between countless responsibilities, directing the Crusade, shaping the institutions that would govern humanity's future, and overseeing projects whose full purpose only a handful of individuals could comprehend. Those who served closest to him often remarked upon his distant focus. It was said that when he studied the report arriving from the Crusade fleets, his gaze sometimes lingered upon particular details, small fragments of information that others might have dismissed. In those moments, the vast machinery of the Imperium seemed to pause ever so slightly, as if awaiting his judgment. But the Emperor rarely spoke publicly of such matters. His vision for humanity was vast, and its completion required patience measured not in years, but in centuries. For the citizens of the Imperium, life continued beneath the banner of unity. Cities expanded across newly compliant worlds. Administrators established the first frameworks of imperial law. Scholars compiled archives describing the rediscovery of humanity's scattered descendants. Across thousands of systems, humanity began to believe that the long darkness of its past had finally ended. Yet far beyond the crowded shipping lanes of the Crusade, there remained regions of the galaxy untouched by imperial exploration. Silent stars watched over ancient planets whose histories stretched back into unrecorded ages. Within those forgotten places, certain discoveries waited patiently, discoveries that would one day reach the ears of the Imperium. And when they did, the quiet confidence of this expanding civilization would begin, slowly, almost imperceptibly, to change. For somewhere in the vast darkness between the stars, something had been found. Something that did not fit within the Imperium's understanding of the galaxy. Something that would cause even the most confident commanders of the Great Crusade to pause, and to wonder what truths might still lie hidden among the ruins of ancient worlds. For now, however, the fleets continued their endless journeys. Engines hummed softly within armored hulls. Navigators watched the distant beacon of Terra, and the banners of the Imperium drifted across the stars like quiet promises of unity. The galaxy was vast, and the Great Crusade had only just begun its long unfolding story. And in the calm silence between distant suns, the first hints of a far greater mystery waited, patiently, for the moment when humanity would finally discover it. As the Great Crusade continued its relentless advance across the galaxy, the Imperium encountered an ever-growing number of worlds whose histories had been shaped by isolation. Each rediscovered system carried fragments of humanity's scattered past, preserved in forms that often surprised the explorers who first arrived in orbit. Some worlds greeted the fleets of the Imperium with relief and celebration. Others resisted fiercely, unwilling to surrender the fragile independence they had maintained through centuries of solitude. Yet among these many encounters, there were occasional discoveries that stirred a quieter reaction within the ranks of Imperial commanders. These were not merely lost colonies. They were places where the past seemed to whisper through ruins far older than humanity's presence. One such discovery emerged in a distant sector along the fringe of newly charted territory, where an expeditionary fleet arrived at a solitary system orbiting a dim yellow star. Initial scans revealed a habitable world below, its atmosphere stable and its continents marked by wide deserts and scattered mountain ranges. At first glance, it appeared to be another example of a forgotten human settlement. The fleet survey vessels descended through the atmosphere to begin routine examinations of the surface. They expected to find the usual patterns: fragmented settlements, remnants of outdated technology, perhaps small populations that had survived the long darkness through adaptation and resilience. Instead, they found silence. The cities that dotted the planet's surface stood empty. From orbit, their structures appeared intact, though strangely uniform, as if constructed according to a design that had been repeated countless times. Towers of pale stone rose above wide plazas. Long avenues stretched between districts that now lay buried beneath drifting sand. No signs of life appeared within the ruins, yet the architecture itself raised immediate questions. Imperial historians and engineers studying the initial reports noted that the buildings did not resemble the patterns typically associated with lost human colonies. Their proportions were unusual, their materials unfamiliar. Even the alignment of the cities across the planet's continents followed geometric arrangements that seemed too precise to be accidental. Landing parties were dispatched to investigate further. Armored transports carried detachments of Imperial Army soldiers and Mechanicum specialists to the surface, where they began the careful process of cataloging the deserted settlements. Their footsteps echoed through plazas that had not felt the presence of living beings for untold centuries. Within the first hours of exploration, it became clear that the ruins were extraordinarily ancient. Layers of dust and erosion suggested that the cities had been abandoned long before humanity's earliest interstellar voyages. Whatever civilization had built them had vanished ages ago, leaving behind only silent monuments beneath a fading sun. For many within the expedition, this discovery carried a familiar implication. The galaxy was filled with remnants of extinct cultures. It was not unusual to find such relics scattered across remote worlds. Yet as the investigation continued, the explorers began to encounter details that challenged these initial assumptions. Carved into the surfaces of certain structures were intricate patterns that did not resemble decorative art. They appeared instead to be part of a complex symbolic system, perhaps a form of written language, though no direct translation could be determined. The symbols repeated across many of the largest buildings. They were arranged in long sequences that stretched along walls and pillars, sometimes forming vast panels that dominated entire chambers. Their design suggested deliberate intention, as though the creators of the ruins had wished to preserve some form of message. The Mechanicum specialists approached these markings with great caution. Servitors scanned the stone surfaces while data scribes recorded every visible pattern. The possibility that the ruins might contain technological secrets could not be ignored. Even fragments of ancient knowledge were considered valuable to the Imperium's growing archives. Yet the more data they gathered, the more unusual the discovery appeared. The structures themselves contained no obvious machinery, no power sources, no weapon systems, no traces of advanced technology remained within the cities. Everything suggested a civilization that had relied upon methods far different from those familiar to the Imperium. It was as though the ruins had been designed not as centers of industry or habitation, but as something else entirely. Monuments. Days passed as the investigation expanded across multiple continents. Each newly explored city revealed the same architectural patterns, the same silent plazas, the same sequences of strange symbols etched into ancient stone. Eventually, one of the expedition survey teams made a discovery that drew the attention of the entire fleet. Deep within a mountain range near the planet's northern hemisphere, they located a structure far larger than any previously examined site. Unlike the cities scattered across the deserts, this complex had been carved directly into the rock itself. Massive stairways descended into shadowed corridors. Walls of dark stone rose high above the explorers as they advanced carefully into the interior chambers. The air within the structure was dry and still, untouched by wind or weather. At the heart of the complex, they found a vast circular hall, its ceiling arched high overhead, supported by enormous pillars covered in the same mysterious symbols that appeared throughout the other ruins. In the center of the chamber stood a single object, a monolithic slab of black stone, polished smooth despite the countless years that had passed. The surface of the slab bore an intricate design. Unlike the scattered symbols carved across the ruins outside, this pattern formed a single unified structure. Concentric rings surrounded a central point, each ring filled with lines and markings arranged with extraordinary precision. The mechanicum adept studying the slab immediately recognized something unsettling. The pattern resembled a map. More specifically, it appeared to represent a stellar chart. Careful analysis revealed that many of the markings corresponded to real star systems located within the surrounding region of the galaxy. Their relative positions matched astronomical data gathered by the expeditionary fleet. Yet there was something deeply unsettling about the map. The central point, the location from which all the rings extended, did not correspond to the planet on which the explorers now stood. Instead, it pointed toward a distant region of space far beyond the boundaries of the current Crusade routes. As this realization spread among the expedition's commanders, the atmosphere within the fleet changed subtly. For the first time since their arrival in the system, the discovery no longer felt like the routine cataloging of ancient ruins. It felt like the uncovering of a deliberate message. Someone, or something, had created these monuments long before humanity's rise to the stars. And at the heart of those monuments, they had left behind a map pointing toward a destination that lay hidden in the deeper darkness of the galaxy. In the quiet halls of the mountain complex, the explorers studied the silent slab while distant winds moved across the empty deserts outside. Above them, the fleet ships drifted in orbit, their sensors scanning the heavens as they considered the implications of what had been found. For the Imperium, which had grown accustomed to the steady certainty of expansion, the discovery carried a faint but unmistakable sense of unease. The Great Crusade had revealed countless lost worlds, but rarely had it uncovered a mystery that seemed to be waiting patiently for someone to find it. In the days that followed the discovery within the mountain complex, the expeditionary fleet remained in orbit above the deserted world, its commanders weighing the implications of the ancient map carved into the black stone slab. What had first appeared to be a routine archaeological curiosity had now become something far more significant. Across the fleet's many vessels, specialists examined the recorded data with growing concentration. The symbols carved into the slab had been carefully translated into navigational coordinates by the fleet's astrocartographers. One by one, the rings and markings were aligned with known star systems in the surrounding sectors. The result was unmistakable. The ancient map was not symbolic. It was precise. The outer rings corresponded to distant stellar clusters already charted by the Imperium's expanding records. Several of these systems had been visited by the Crusade fleets in recent decades, and their positions matched the map's geometry with unsettling accuracy. Yet as the rings drew closer to the center, the pattern began to diverge from Imperial knowledge. The inner region of the chart described a cluster of stars located deep within a largely unexplored volume of space. No Imperial expeditions had yet reached that area. The Crusade frontier lay several hundred light years away, separated by unpredictable warp routes and uncharted stellar phenomena. In practical terms, it was a region beyond the Imperium's current reach. That fact alone raised questions. If the creators of the ruins had mapped those stars with such precision, then they must have possessed the ability to travel between them. Their civilization had clearly extended far beyond the single abandoned world where the monuments now stood. But there were no records of such a civilization within Imperial archives. The galaxy had revealed many extinct cultures during the Crusade, yet few had left behind maps that seemed to anticipate the curiosity of future explorers. The slab's design suggested intention. Its central point had been emphasized deliberately, surrounded by layers of information meant to guide those capable of understanding it. Within the command halls of the expeditionary flagship, senior officers gathered to review the findings. Their discussion unfolded slowly, marked by careful analysis rather than excitement. The Imperium's commanders had learned long ago that curiosity among the stars must always be tempered by caution. The galaxy had a way of concealing dangers within the most intriguing discoveries. Still, The evidence before them could not be ignored. If the map was genuine, and every indication suggested that it was, then it pointed toward a location that someone had once considered important enough to preserve across the vast span of ages. One of the fleet's navigators studied the coordinates with particular interest. The warp routes leading toward the marked region appeared unstable but not impossible. With sufficient preparation, a careful translation through the Imperium could bring the fleet within range of the indicated stars. It would be a difficult journey, but it could be done. The decision that followed was not made lightly. Expeditionary fleets of the Great Crusade were responsible not only for exploration, but also for the steady expansion of imperial authority. Diverting resources toward an uncertain mystery carried strategic consequences. Yet there was also another factor to consider. The Imperium's guiding philosophy during the Crusade emphasized knowledge and unity. If the ruins represented a fragment of forgotten galactic history, then understanding their purpose could benefit humanity's future. The Emperor himself had often encouraged a careful study of ancient relics, believing that the lessons of the past could illuminate the path forward. In the end, the fleet's commanders reached a quiet agreement. A small detachment would follow the coordinates. The majority of the fleet would continue its assigned campaign routes, bringing nearby systems into compliance and expanding the Imperium's influence. But a handful of vessels, equipped for long-range exploration, would travel toward the location marked at the center of the ancient map. The mission would proceed cautiously. If the discovery proved harmless, the Imperium would gain valuable knowledge of a previously unknown region. If danger awaited there, the limited size of the expedition would prevent unnecessary losses. Preparations began immediately. Within the hangar bays of the selected ships, crews worked in silence as they loaded additional supplies and recalibrated navigational systems. Data archives containing the recorded symbols from the ruins were transferred to secure storage. Every detail of the ancient slab was preserved for future analysis. Meanwhile, the ruins themselves were carefully sealed. Before departing the deserted world, Mechanicum engineers established monitoring devices around the mountain complex. The slab remained untouched within its vast chamber, illuminated only by the faint glow of Imperial sensor units. For the moment, the Imperium would leave the monument where it had been discovered. Its message had already been received. Above the planet's silent deserts, the fleet's vessels slowly shifted into formation. Engines awakened with low vibrations that echoed through armored hulls. One by one, the ships prepared to enter the warp. The chosen expedition consisted of only a few cruisers and their escorts, small by the standards of the Great Crusade, yet formidable enough to defend themselves against unforeseen threats. When the moment arrived, the navigators opened their minds to the distant light of Terra's psychic beacon. Reality bent and folded as the vessels translated into the Imperium. Beyond the viewports, the familiar patterns of normal space dissolved into the shifting tides of the warp. Colors without names rippled across the void as the fleet began its long journey toward the unknown coordinates. Time within the warp moved strangely. Days and weeks passed within the ships as their crews maintained careful watch over every system. Navigators studied the currents of unreality with constant vigilance, adjusting their course whenever the tides threatened to push them astray. During these long passages, many among the crews reflected upon the strange chain of events that had brought them here. A silent world, ancient monuments, a map left behind by a vanished civilization. Such discoveries were rare even during the vast exploration of the Great Crusade. Eventually, after many careful translations through the warp, the fleet emerged once more into the calm darkness of real space. Before them stretched a region of the galaxy that no imperial records had yet described. Stars burned quietly in unfamiliar arrangements. Their light reached the fleet across immeasurable distances, unchanged by the passage of countless millennia. Somewhere among those distant points of light lay the location marked at the center of the ancient map. As the ship's sensors began their slow survey of the surrounding systems, a subtle tension spread through the command decks. The discovery on the desert world had suggested that something important might exist here. Something deliberate. Something that had been waiting for a very long time. Far ahead of the fleet, one particular star system began to draw the attention of the survey instruments. Its readings did not resemble those of ordinary stellar environments. Patterns appeared within the data, faint anomalies that hinted at structures or signals unlike anything commonly found in nature. The officers studying the information exchanged quiet glances. Their long journey through the warp had finally brought them to the place indicated by the ancient slab. And already, the first sign suggested that whatever waited within this system had not been entirely lost to time. The fleet approached the newly identified system with deliberate caution, its vessels advancing in slow formation as sensor rays extended their reach into the surrounding darkness. After weeks spent traveling through the unpredictable tides of the warp, the calm stability of real space felt almost unreal to the crew stationed along the command decks. Before them burned a solitary white star. Its light spread outward across a quiet expanse of planetary bodies, rocky worlds, drifting asteroid belts, and distant clouds of frozen debris. At first glance, the system appeared unremarkable, little different from countless others charted during the Great Crusade. Yet the fleet's instruments soon revealed subtle irregularities. Long-range scanners detected patterns within the inner regions of the system that could not be easily explained by natural formations. The readings were faint and scattered, appearing as intermittent signals that rose briefly above the background radiation before fading again. These fluctuations were not random. They followed a rhythm. Across the command decks of the leading cruiser, senior officers studied the incoming data while the fleet maintained a careful distance from the system's inner orbit. Servitors processed vast streams of information, comparing the signals against every known category of astronomical phenomenon. Nothing matched. The patterns appeared artificial, yet their origin remained unclear. To better understand the anomaly, a group of survey vessels was dispatched toward the second planet of the system, a barren world whose surface seemed to contain the strongest concentration of unusual readings. The small craft descended slowly through the thin atmosphere, their sensor rays sweeping across the rocky terrain below. From orbit, the planet appeared cold and lifeless. Wide plains of gray stone stretched across its surface, broken only by jagged mountain ranges and deep impact craters. No signs of vegetation or natural water sources were visible. The world seemed as silent as a desert planet where the ancient map had first been discovered. But as the survey vessel drew closer, new details began to emerge. Scattered across the plains were vast geometric shapes, patterns so large they had remained invisible from high orbit. Only at lower altitude did their outlines become clear. They were structures, not buildings in the conventional sense, but enormous formations rising only slightly above the planet's surface. From the air they resembled rings, arcs, and intersecting lines carved directly into the bedrock itself. Each structure stretched for many kilometers. Together, they formed an immense network that spread across hundreds of miles of terrain. The explorers observing the images felt a quiet sense of unease. Natural processes could not have produced such arrangements. The precision of the line suggested deliberate design on a planetary scale. Yet there were no surrounding cities, no support facilities, no evidence of habitation, only the silent patterns embedded within the stone. As the survey craft transmitted their findings back to the fleet, the expedition scientists began comparing the structures with a map discovered on the desert world. The similarities were unmistakable. Certain segments of the planetary formations mirrored the same geometric arrangements that had appeared within the ancient slab's concentric rings. Though the scale was vastly larger, the mathematical relationships between the shapes followed identical principles. It was as if the map had been a simplified reflection of the structures now visible on the planet's surface. The implications of this realization spread quickly through the fleet. The coordinates carved into the ancient monument had not merely pointed toward a distant location. They had described a place where the same mysterious design existed on a far greater scale. The structures below were not random ruins. They were part of the same system of symbols. Soon after this conclusion was reached, the intermittent signals detected earlier began to strengthen. The survey craft hovering above the formations recorded faint pulses of energy emerging from deep beneath the planet's crust. The signals were weak but consistent. They rose in measured intervals, repeating the same sequence over and over again. Mechanicum specialists aboard the fleet's vessels worked to interpret the transmissions. At first, they believed the signals might represent a malfunctioning device left behind by the unknown builders of the structures. But as the data accumulated, another possibility began to emerge. The pulses were too regular, too precise. They resembled a beacon. Not a beacon designed for communication in the traditional sense, but one that simply announced its existence to any instruments capable of detecting it. A quiet signal repeating endlessly through the ages. The question that followed was both simple and unsettling. Why? If the builders of this immense planetary structure had vanished millions of years ago, why would a beacon still remain active beneath the surface? And more importantly, what purpose had the structure originally served? The fleet's commanders debated these questions carefully before authorizing further exploration. Eventually, a decision was made to dispatch a landing force to investigate the source of the energy pulses. A group of armored transports descended toward the largest of the surface formations, carrying soldiers, engineers, and mechanicum adepts equipped with advanced scanning equipment. Their landing site lay within a massive circular depression carved into the stone plains. From the ground, the scale of the structure became even more apparent. The curved walls of the formation stretched toward the horizon, their surfaces marked by faint grooves that followed the same geometric logic observed from orbit. It was clear that the structure had once been carefully maintained, but now it stood abandoned beneath a silent sky. The explorers began their work methodically, tracing the direction of the energy pulses toward a central location within the formation. As they advanced across the cold stone, their instruments recorded rising levels of electromagnetic activity. Something beneath the surface was still functioning. After several hours of scanning, the team located the source. At the center of the structure, hidden beneath layers of ancient rock, lay a sealed chamber constructed from materials far denser than the surrounding stone. The chamber appeared to house a device that continued to emit the faint rhythmic signal detected by the fleet sensors. Excavation equipment was brought forward, and the outer layers of rock were carefully removed. Slowly, a portion of the hidden chamber came into view. Its surface was smooth and dark, almost identical to the black stone slab discovered on the desert world. Along its exterior ran a familiar pattern of symbols, smaller versions of the markings that had once formed the ancient map. The explorers paused as their lights illuminated the chamber. For countless ages it had remained buried beneath the planet's surface, silently repeating its message into the void. And now, for the first time in uncounted centuries, someone had finally arrived to hear it again. Above the barren plains, the fleet waited patiently in orbit while the investigation continued. Within the quiet depths of the buried chamber, the faint beacon continued its steady rhythm, unchanged by the passage of time and undisturbed by the rise and fall of civilizations across the galaxy. It had been built to endure, and it had endured. The excavation of the buried chamber proceeded slowly, guided by a careful respect for the unknown technology hidden beneath the planet's ancient crust. The Imperium had encountered countless relics during the long progress of the Great Crusade, but experience had taught its explorers that the remnants of forgotten civilizations often carried dangers as well as knowledge. Servitors and mechanicum labor units worked methodically around the exposed structure, removing the surrounding layers of stone with delicate precision. Each fragment of rock was catalogued and scanned before being moved aside, ensuring that no trace of the chamber's design would be lost. As more of the structure emerged into view, its true scale became apparent. The chamber extended far deeper than the initial surveys had suggested. What at first appeared to be a single enclosed vault was in fact only the outermost layer of a much larger construction buried within the planet's crust. Beneath the exposed surface lay additional sections of dense material, arranged in concentric formations that mirrored the geometric patterns etched across the planet's plains. The device at the center of this arrangement continued to emit its faint, rhythmic signal. Even after the surrounding rock had been removed, the pulses remained steady and unchanged. Their energy output was remarkably small, barely detectable beyond the immediate area. Yet the signal repeated with flawless consistency. It had done so for an immeasurable span of time. Mechanicum adepts studying the exposed chamber noted another unusual detail. The material from which the structure had been built did not resemble any alloy known to the Imperium. It possessed a smooth, dark surface of polished stone, yet its density and resilience suggested a composition far more complex. When cutting tools were applied to a small section of the outer casing, they found that the material resisted most forms of mechanical stress. Even the advanced instruments carried by the mechanicum struggled to leave visible marks upon its surface. Whatever methods had been used to create the structure, they belonged to a technological tradition very different from the Imperium's own. Despite these challenges, the explorers continued their work. A narrow entry point was eventually located along the chamber's upper surface, a seam so finely crafted that it remained invisible beneath layers of dust and mineral deposits. After several hours of careful examination, the mechanicum specialist determined that the seam formed part of a sealed access panel. With cautious adjustments to their equipment, they succeeded in opening it. The panel slid aside with surprising ease. A breath of stale air escaped from the chamber's interior, carrying with it the faint scent of minerals long sealed away from the surface. Lights were lowered into the opening, illuminating a narrow shaft that descended into darkness. For a moment, the explorers paused. Though the signal continued its steady rhythm, the interior of the chamber showed no signs of active machinery. There were no moving components, no visible power sources. The device responsible for the beacon remained hidden deeper within the structure. Eventually, a small exploration team prepared to descend. Equipped with protective armor and portable scanners, they entered the shaft one by one, their footsteps echoing faintly against the smooth inner walls. The passage led downward for several dozen meters before opening into a larger chamber carved with the same geometric precision that marked the structures on the surface. Within this interior space, the origin of the signal finally became visible. At the center of the chamber stood a cylindrical pillar composed of the same dark material as the outer shell. Its surface was engraved with countless small markings, symbols that resembled the language discovered on the desert world's ancient monuments. Faint pulses of light moved slowly across the pillar's surface, traveling along these carved lines in repeating sequences. The beacon was alive with quiet activity. The explorers observed the device for several minutes before approaching it more closely. Their instruments confirmed that the pillar contained a compact energy source operating far beyond the capabilities of Imperial technology. It produced no detectable heat, no mechanical vibrations, only the gentle rhythm of the signal. One of the Mechanicum adepts began recording the sequences of light as they traveled across the carved symbols. The patterns appeared deliberate, forming structured intervals that suggested some form of encoded information. Yet the meaning remained elusive. The symbols themselves did not correspond directly with the sequences carved upon the ancient map. Though they shared the same visual style, their arrangement here followed a more complex structure. It was as though the pillar contained an extended message, one designed to be understood only by those capable of studying it with patience. As the data were transmitted back to the fleet in orbit, additional analysis began immediately. Linguists and mathematicians compared the sequences against known communication systems, searching for underlying patterns that might reveal the purpose of the beacon. Slowly, fragments of meaning began to emerge. The pulses appeared to describe spatial coordinates similar to those found on the original map. However, they extended far beyond a single location. The sequences referenced numerous positions scattered across distant regions of the galaxy. Each set of coordinates repeated the same structure: a location, a corresponding symbol, and a brief sequence of pulses marking an interval of time. When these fragments were assembled together, a quiet realization began to spread among the analysts studying the data. The beacon was not simply identifying its own position. It was part of a network. Somewhere across the galaxy, other devices like this one might exist, each quietly transmitting the same encoded message across the ages. Together, they could form a vast system designed to guide explorers towards specific locations. Yet the purpose of those locations remained uncertain. Were they markers left behind by the creators of the structures, or warnings meant to keep future civilizations away? Within the underground chamber, the explorers stood in silence as the pillar's faint light continued its endless cycle. The device had waited patiently through the rise and fall of civilizations, repeating its message into the void without interruption. Now, for the first time in untold ages, its signals were being observed and studied once more. Far above the barren plains, the fleet's vessels drifted in quiet formation around the distant planet. Their commanders reviewed the growing body of data with careful attention. What had begun as a simple investigation of ancient ruins had slowly revealed something far larger. A map, a system of monuments, and now, a beacon that hinted at the existence of others scattered across the galaxy. The Great Crusade had uncovered many wonders during its expansion, but this discovery felt different. Because the deeper the Imperium looked into the message left behind by the vanished builders, the more it seemed that the galaxy still held secrets waiting far beyond the edges of human knowledge. And somewhere among the stars marked within the beacon's endless signal, another piece of that ancient design continued to wait in silence. Continue with Chapter 6 word count must be 900, not less or more. It followed a precise cycle. Each sequence began with a coordinate, an exact position within the galaxy. That position was then followed by a secondary cluster of symbols that appeared to represent some form of classification or designation. Finally, the sequence ended with a measured interval before the pattern began again with a new location. The pillar continued this process without interruption. Again and again, it listed stars. Some of those stars were already known to the Imperium. Others lay beyond the boundaries of current exploration, existing only as faint points of light within incomplete star charts. What drew the analyst's attention most strongly was a repetition. Certain coordinates appeared frequently within the transmission cycle, while others occurred only once before disappearing from a sequence. The recurring locations formed a pattern of their own, suggesting that the beacon was not simply listing random systems scattered across the galaxy. It was prioritizing them. Across the fleet's many vessels, scholars and navigators worked together to project these coordinates onto Imperial star maps. Slowly, a larger structure began to reveal itself. The repeating systems formed a rough alignment stretching across a distant section of the galaxy, one that the Imperium had not yet explored in detail. The stars within this alignment were separated by vast distances, yet when viewed together they formed a long arc curving gently along the outer regions of the galactic spiral. It was not a perfect line, but it was far too organized to be coincidence. This realization produced a quiet tension among the expedition's senior officers. The beacon signal suggested the existence of a chain of locations deliberately arranged across the galaxy. The structures discovered on the desert world and the buried device beneath this planet might represent only two elements within that much larger system. If that was true, then the civilization responsible for building them had possessed a reach that extended across immense stretches of space. Yet no record of such a civilization existed within the Imperium's historical archives. As this possibility was considered, another discovery emerged from the analysis of the pillar's transmissions. One of the Mechanicum adepts had begun studying the intervals between each sequence, measuring the exact timing of the beacon cycles. At first, the intervals appeared perfectly uniform, but closer examination revealed subtle variations. The differences were extremely small, barely noticeable against the steady rhythm of the signal. As the investigation of the buried chamber continued, the expeditionary fleet remained in steady orbit above the silent world, its vessels positioned like patient sentinels against the pale glow of the distant star. What had begun as a simple archaeological curiosity had now developed into a mystery whose scale extended far beyond a single planet. Within the fleet's command decks, data from the underground pillar was studied with increasing intensity. The sequences of light that traveled across its engraved surface were recorded continuously, their patterns preserved and transmitted to analysts aboard every vessel involved in the expedition. At first, the signals appeared repetitive, almost monotonous in their rhythm, but as the recordings accumulated, the structure hidden within the pulses became clearer. The beacon did not transmit randomly. It followed a precise cycle. Each sequence began with a coordinate, an exact position within the galaxy. That position was then followed by a secondary cluster of symbols that appeared to represent some form of classification or designation. Finally, the sequence ended with a measured interval before the pattern began again with a new location. The pillar continued this process without interruption. Again and again, it listed stars. Some of those stars were already known to the Imperium. Others lay beyond the boundaries of current exploration, existing only as faint points of light within incomplete star charts. What drew the analyst's attention most strongly was a repetition. Certain coordinates appeared frequently within the transmission cycle, while others occurred only once before disappearing from the sequence. The recurring locations formed a pattern of their own, suggesting that the beacon was not simply listing random systems scattered across the galaxy. It was prioritizing them. Across the fleet's many vessels, scholars and navigators worked together to project these coordinates onto Imperial star maps. Slowly, a larger structure began to reveal itself. The repeating systems formed a rough alignment stretching across a distant section of the galaxy, one that the Imperium had not yet explored in detail. The stars within this alignment were separated by vast distances, yet when viewed together they formed a long arc curving gently along the outer regions of the galactic spiral. It was not a perfect line, but it was far too organized to be coincidence. This realization produced a quiet tension among the expedition's senior officers. The beacon signal suggested the existence of a chain of locations deliberately arranged across the galaxy. The structures discovered on the desert world and the buried device beneath this planet might represent only two elements within that much larger system. If that was true, then the civilization responsible for building them had possessed a reach that extended across immense stretches of space. Yet no record of such a civilization existed within the Imperium's historical archives. As this possibility was considered, another discovery emerged from the analysis of the pillar's transmissions. One of the Mechanicum adepts had begun studying the intervals between each sequence, measuring the exact timing of the beacon cycles. At first, the intervals appeared perfectly uniform, but closer examination revealed subtle variations. The differences were extremely small, barely noticeable against the steady rhythm of the signal, but they followed a pattern. Each interval corresponded to a specific mathematical ratio that repeated across multiple transmission cycles. When these ratios were applied to the spatial coordinates contained within the beacon's message, they revealed an additional layer of meaning hidden beneath the surface of the signal. The intervals were not simply pauses. They represented distance. More specifically, they described the relative spacing between the stars listed within the transmission. The beacon was not only identifying locations across the galaxy, it was describing their relationships to one another. When this information was plotted onto the Imperium's navigational charts, the resulting structure became even more striking. The chain of repeating coordinates now appeared as a series of interconnected points forming a vast network that stretched across several galactic sectors. Each location seemed to occupy a precise position within that network, like nodes within a larger design. The scholars studying this map began to consider a possibility that few had anticipated when the expedition first arrived in the system. The ancient builders had not merely scattered monuments across the galaxy. They had constructed a framework. What that framework had been intended to accomplish remained unclear. Perhaps it had once guided the travel routes of an advanced civilization. Perhaps it had served as a system of markers pointing toward resources or safe passages through hazardous regions of space. Or perhaps its purpose had been something far more complex. Within the underground chamber, the pillar continued its endless transmission while the explorers carefully examined every visible surface. The symbols carved into the device's structure seemed to mirror the network now displayed across the fleet's star maps. In several places, small variations in the markings suggested additional layers of information yet to be deciphered. It was possible that the beacon contained far more than a simple list of coordinates. If the entire message could be understood, it might reveal the full extent of the ancient builder's design. Yet time pressed upon the expedition's decisions. The Great Crusade was a vast and demanding campaign. Fleets could not remain indefinitely in orbit around a single unexplored world, no matter how intriguing the discovery might be. Resources were limited, and the Imperium's expansion required constant movement toward new frontiers. After several days of careful discussion, the commanders of the fleet reached a measured conclusion. The beacon would continue to be studied, but the expedition itself would not remain here forever. Instead, the information gathered from the pillar would be transmitted back toward the central regions of the Crusade, where larger research institutions could analyze it in greater detail. Copies of the coordinates and symbolic patterns were prepared for delivery to Terra itself. If the network truly spanned the galaxy as the data suggested, then the Emperor's advisors would undoubtedly wish to examine its implications. Meanwhile, the fleet would begin preparations to depart the system. Before leaving, however, a final survey of the surrounding planets was conducted to ensure that no additional structures remained undiscovered. Sensor arrays swept across the distant asteroid belts and outer orbits, searching for any signs of artificial formations similar to those found on the Second World. The results revealed nothing. The buried chamber and its beacon appeared to be the system's only remaining relic of the ancient builders. When the survey was complete, the expedition's vessels slowly repositioned themselves above the planet's silent plains. Below them, the excavated chamber was carefully sealed once again. The pillar remained in place within its subterranean vault, continuing its steady pulse into the darkness above. For countless ages it had transmitted its message without an audience. Now its signals had been heard. Yet the greater meaning of those signals remained uncertain. As the fleet prepared to depart, many among the crews felt a quiet sense that the mystery was far from complete. Because somewhere beyond the distant stars listed within the beacon's endless cycle, other structures might still exist. Other monuments, other signals, and perhaps, somewhere along that vast network stretching through the galaxy, the final purpose of the ancient design waited patiently for discovery. In the quiet days following the final surveys of the system, preparations began for the fleet's departure. The ships of the expeditionary force adjusted their positions in orbit, while the last streams of data were transmitted from the surface installations. Every measurement gathered from the underground chamber, every recording of the beacon's signal, and every image of the vast planetary formations was preserved with meticulous care. The discovery could not remain isolated within a single expedition. If the ancient network truly extended across the galaxy, then its implications would reach far beyond the authority of the fleet that had uncovered it. Such knowledge would eventually need to be placed before the highest councils of the Imperium, and ultimately before the Emperor himself. Within the command sanctums of the fleet's largest cruiser, data scribes and astropathic choirs worked together to prepare the transmission that would carry news of the discovery toward the heart of human civilization. The task required both technological precision and psychic endurance, for messages sent across the vast distances of the Imperium relied upon the fragile medium of the warp. Astropaths entered their meditative states within carefully shielded chambers, their minds linking with one another in quiet concentration. The information gathered by the expedition was condensed into symbolic constructs that could survive the distortions of immaterial space. Coordinates were encoded. Patterns were preserved. Descriptions of the beacon and its transmissions were woven into psychic impressions that could be received and interpreted by distant choirs stationed along the communication routes of the Great Crusade. The process required patience. Each fragment of information had to be shaped carefully to prevent corruption during its passage through the warp. The galaxy was vast, and even the Emperor's expanding Imperium could not yet bridge those distances with certainty. But eventually, the message was ready. With solemn ritual, the astropathic choir released a transmission into the currents of the Imperium. Their thoughts carried the discovery outward across unimaginable distances, passing from mind to mind along the chain of psychic relays that connected the distant frontiers of the Crusade to the throne world of humanity. Once the message had been sent, a quiet stillness settled across the fleet. For many among the crew, the act carried a sense of finality. The mystery of the beacon had now been entrusted to the greater machinery of the Imperium. Scholars, strategists, and perhaps even the Emperor's own advisors would examine the data and determine what meaning could be drawn from it. Until then, the expedition could only continue its duties. The Great Crusade did not pause for long contemplation. Across the galaxy, countless worlds still awaited rediscovery. Humanity's scattered colonies remained divided by centuries of isolation, and the fleets of the Imperium moved constantly to reunite them beneath a single banner. Even the most intriguing discoveries could not delay that mission indefinitely. Yet before the fleet departed the system, one final decision was made regarding the buried chamber beneath the planet's plains. Rather than sealing the site completely and abandoning it to silence once more, the commanders chose to leave behind a small monitoring station. Automated sensor arrays were positioned around the excavation site, their instruments calibrated to record any changes in the beacon signal. These devices would transmit their observations periodically through long-range communication buoys placed in the system's outer orbit. If the beacon never altered its transmission, if its steady rhythm shifted even slightly, the Imperium would know. The installation of the monitoring station required several days of careful work. Mechanicum engineers supervised the placement of each sensor unit, ensuring that the ancient structure beneath the surface would remain undisturbed. Throughout the process, the beacon itself continued its endless cycle. Pulse, pause, coordinate, interval. Again and again, its quiet message echoed through the depths of the chamber, unchanged by the presence of its new observers. At last, when every system had been tested and every archive secured, the fleet prepared for departure. Engines awakened across the armored hulls of the cruisers and escort vessels. Navigation officers plotted the first stages of their return route toward the nearest Crusade corridor, where established warp passages would guide them back into the expanding territories of the Imperium. One by one, the ships aligned themselves for translation into the warp. From the command decks, officers observed the silent world below, a barren landscape marked by immense geometric formations that stretched across the stone plains like the faint memory of forgotten design. Beneath that surface, the beacon continued to transmit its message into the void. It would do so long after the fleet had vanished into the currents of the Imperium. Soon the moment of departure arrived. Reality folded around the vessels as their warp drives ignited, drawing them away from a quiet system and back into the strange tides of the Imperium. The stars of normal space dissolved beyond the viewports, replaced by the shifting colors of the warp's endless ocean. The expedition was over, yet the mystery it had uncovered remained. Far away, the astropathic message continued its long journey toward Terra. If the transmission survived the dangers of the warp, it would eventually reach the psychic halls where the Imperium's most trusted interpreters received such distant signals. There, the pattern contained within the beacon's message would be studied once more. The chain of coordinates, the vast network stretching across unexplored regions of the galaxy, and the quiet possibility that the ancient builders of these monuments had left behind a design whose purpose had not yet been revealed. For now, the fleet moved on with the unending advance of the Great Crusade. But somewhere among the countless stars listed within the beacon's endless signal, other locations continued to wait in silence. Other monuments might still stand beneath alien skies. Other signals might still be repeating their ancient patterns through the darkness. And if the scattered pieces of that forgotten network were ever brought together again, the Imperium might finally learn what discovery had once inspired such careful preparation across the vast and silent reaches of the galaxy. Weeks passed as the expeditionary fleet traveled back toward the established routes of the Great Crusade. The warp currents carried them steadily, their progress slow but unbroken, while the message sent to Terra made its long journey through the Imperium. Within the corridors of the flagship, officers and mechanicum specialists maintained constant observation of the data gathered from the buried chamber, reviewing recordings of the beacon and preparing additional notes for eventual analysis. The Great Crusade did not pause for reflection, yet a quiet tension had taken hold among the expedition's crew. The discovery of the planetary structures and their central beacon had introduced questions that no commander aboard the ships could yet answer. How had a civilization unknown to the Imperium constructed devices of such precision? Why had these signals persisted for uncounted ages? And most unsettling of all, what lay at the further coordinates embedded within the sequences of the transmission? As the fleet moved closer to known space, a distant response arrived. The astropathic transmission sent weeks before had finally reached the outer relay points of the Crusade, where it was received by an Imperial choir trained to interpret distant psychic messages. Their voices, harmonized in resonant chords, projected the data onward toward Terra, conveying both the raw information and the impressions of urgency embedded within the original transmission. Within the psychic currents of the warp, the message traveled across countless light years, passing from one choir to another. Each relay amplified the signal while carefully preserving its subtle details, the intricate sequences of symbols, intervals, and coordinates intact. Slowly, the Imperium central authorities began to sense the scope of what had been uncovered. High within the Administratum on Terra, senior liaisons of the Mechanicum convened to assess the incoming data. Holo projections displayed the star charts, the network of repeating coordinates, and the intricate symbols derived from the pillar's beacon. Scholars, priests, and navigators studied each detail in hushed consultation. The transmission had arrived with clarity, yet its implications were staggering. "This is no ordinary monument," one senior Magos remarked, his voice calm but measured with apprehension. The data suggests a network spanning multiple sectors, potentially thousands of light years in extent. The designers were not merely marking locations, they were encoding relationships between them. Each sequence contains multiple layers of information. Another, younger in rank but no less perceptive, added, "If these coordinates are accurate, the Crusade has barely touched the perimeter of this system. There may be many more structures like the ones recently discovered. Each one could harbor unknown technologies, or knowledge lost to time." Outside of Terra, in the fleets advancing across distant sectors, the first sign of official response arrived through encrypted communications. A dispatch ordered the expeditionary force to maintain its current survey records while preparing additional vessels for eventual follow-up. Specialists in archaeology, linguistics, and xeno studies will be dispatched once resources allowed, indicating that the Imperium recognized the significance of the discovery but sought careful planning before further exploration. Back aboard the expedition's flagship, the news was received quietly. No celebrations erupted. The discovery's gravity demanded contemplation rather than jubilation. The crew understood that the messages now in transit could alter the trajectory of the Great Crusade itself, shaping future priorities as Imperial authorities decided how best to investigate this network of ancient signals. Amid the calm activity, the beacon beneath the surface of the distant world continued its endless pulse. No ship could yet observe its cycles directly. The planet remained silent under the pale light of its star. Yet the pillar's signal had already traveled farther than its creators might ever have imagined, extending across centuries of time and millions of miles of space. Scholars aboard the fleet attempted tentative translations of the light sequences. Small fragments suggested repeated groupings of stars, perhaps reference points or markers. Others seemed to represent intervals of time, potentially indicating operational cycles or historical markers. The full meaning remained obscured, Yet it was clear that the message was designed to endure. In the quiet chambers of the Mechanicum, one theory took shape. The builders had intended these beacons to survive the collapse of their civilization, to continue transmitting guidance long after their own presence had vanished. Their design emphasized endurance over utility, the careful preservation of information against the passing of eons. The fleet's officers considered this quietly. The galaxy was vast and dangerous, yet here was a signal that had endured far longer than even the oldest starships of the Crusade. If the Imperium could one day trace the full network, it might uncover knowledge unparalleled in its history, perhaps extending beyond even the Emperor's immediate comprehension. Yet for now, the signal remained a riddle. The coordinates, repeated endlessly through the cycles of the beacon, hinted at patterns that the Imperium had only begun to discern. Its message was patient, waiting silently for those capable of understanding. As the expeditionary vessel prepared to reintegrate with the main routes of the Great Crusade, the fleet's crew took one final survey of the distant world below. The geometric formation stretched across the plains, silent and enduring, and the subterranean pillar continued its endless pulse beneath layers of stone. Somewhere, far beyond the borders of explored space, the rest of the network continued to wait. Its creators had vanished, leaving only the enduring rhythm of light and energy to mark their presence. The Imperium had only glimpsed the first fragment of this pattern, and as the fleet slipped quietly into the currents of the warp once more, the thought lingered among those who had witnessed the discovery. The galaxy was far older, far more intricate, and far less understood than humanity had ever imagined. The beacon's pulse continued, and somewhere, in the silent reaches of space, other parts of its message awaited discovery. The fleet had rejoined the main corridors of the Great Crusade, its ships now resuming the steady rhythm of expansion across the galaxy. Systems that had long awaited imperial reclamation were slowly being brought into alignment under the authority of the Emperor, yet the minds of the expeditionary officers remained preoccupied with the memory of the distant world and the pillar buried deep within its surface. Reports of the discovery had reached Terra, their content reviewed by councils of Mechanicum scholars, navigators, and senior administrative officials. Every detail of the beacon, the planetary formations, and the sequences of transmitted coordinates had been preserved, each observation carefully logged and catalogued for further study. Yet even as the Imperium central authorities received the data, the scope of its implications began to ripple quietly through the warp, stirring currents that had long lain dormant. In the Immaterium, the psychic echoes of the pillar's pulse spread outward. Though faint and subtle, the rhythm of its signal carried a resonance unlike that of ordinary warp phenomena. Astropaths stationed on nearby Crusade fleets reported minor disturbances in their meditative states, flickers of insight, fleeting impressions of structures beyond the perception of standard instruments, and a sense that something vast and ordered lay hidden within the galaxy's darkness. These disturbances were not uniform, nor were they consistent in intensity. Some navigators reported an unshakable sense of anticipation, as if the pulse itself were calling to those who could perceive it. Others noted a quiet tension, a subtle disquiet that seemed to emanate from the very edges of the Immaterium, hinting at something ancient and deliberate. On board the expedition's flagship, the officers gathered regularly to review the incoming analyses. The sequences of coordinates from the pillar were compared against the galaxy's existing star charts, revealing alignments that suggested routes through regions previously considered uncharted or hazardous. Warp currents in these regions were erratic, occasionally violent, yet the geometric relationships implied by the ancient signal offered a framework through which careful navigation might be possible. For the Mechanicum, these observations were both exhilarating and troubling. If the sequences were intended to guide travelers, they represented knowledge far beyond current human understanding. The sheer precision and endurance of the signal implied a civilization whose capabilities had been unmatched and whose disappearance had left only scattered monuments across space. At the same time, the Imperium's commanders acknowledged the practical limitations imposed by the Great Crusade. The fleet could not remain indefinitely on one system, no matter how intriguing. Strategic objectives, the reclamation of distant colonies, and the consolidation of imperial authority demanded attention. Yet the implications of the pillar and its beacon could not be ignored. A series of directives was issued. Survey teams and Mechanicum specialists would continue to analyze the sequences of coordinates, constructing models of the potential network that the ancient builders had left behind. Additional vessels, equipped with advanced sensors and navigational support, were to be prepared for eventual dispatch, tasked with investigating the locations indicated by the beacon should Imperial resources allow. Even as preparations were made, the first signs of a more subtle consequence began to appear. Warp-traveling vessels passing through regions near the distant system reported small anomalies in their readings. Sensors picked up faint, otherwise unexplainable fluctuations in local currents, and astropaths occasionally experienced brief impressions of structures or forms that vanished as quickly as they appeared. The officers aboard the flagship debated the origin of these disturbances. Some argued that the pillar's signal could be influencing the local warp environment directly, its rhythmic pulse resonating beyond its material confines. Others considered the possibility of residual echoes left behind by the ancient builders themselves, psychic impressions embedded within the galaxy by a civilization whose understanding of space and time far exceeded that of contemporary humanity. Among the crew, a quiet tension grew, subtle yet pervasive. The memory of the pillar's pulse, so steady and deliberate, had left an impression that lingered long after the fleet had departed the distant system. It was a reminder of the galaxy's vastness and of humanity's limited comprehension, a persistent suggestion that the Imperium's understanding of its surroundings remained fragmentary at best. In the hours of watch, many of the officers found themselves returning to the imagery of the planetary formations, the vast geometric patterns etched into the plains, and the black pillar's endless signal. Discussions were held regarding the potential purpose of the network, whether it was a navigation system, a repository of knowledge, or perhaps a mechanism of warning. Each theory carried implications that were as profound as they were unsettling. In the Imperium, the beacon continued its work silently, its pulses traversing the current of warp space without interruption. Its message remained consistent, unaltered by the passage of time, yet its full meaning remained locked behind layers of encoded symbols and mathematical precision. The sequences, meticulously observed and recorded, formed a silent dialogue across the ages, awaiting those capable of understanding. As the fleet continued its forward progress, carrying the first reports back toward Terra, it became increasingly clear that the discovery was not simply an isolated curiosity. The pillar, the structures across the planet's plains, and the network of coordinates represented a system whose scale and intent were beyond immediate comprehension. The Great Crusade had revealed countless wonders, yet few held the quiet, enduring resonance of the distant beacon. Its signals, repeated endlessly beneath the stone, reached far beyond the grasp of ordinary observation. And somewhere, across the uncharted stretches of the galaxy, other monuments likely waited in silence, their messages unbroken, their signals steady, and their purpose still concealed within the intricate patterns of light and stone. The Imperium had glimpsed only the first fragment of an order older than many of the stars themselves. And in that realization lay both wonder and unease, a quiet shadow stretching across the warp, hinting at discoveries yet to come. The fleet pressed onward through the corridors of the Great Crusade, the distant stars streaking past the viewports as the warp currents carried them steadily toward more familiar sectors of Imperial space. Yet, despite the return to routine operations, the memory of the distant system and the pillar beneath its surface persisted, quietly shaping the thoughts of officers, scholars, and mechanicum adept alike. Reports continued to arrive from the automated monitoring station left behind upon the barren world. Its sensors confirmed the persistence of the pillar's rhythmic pulse, each sequence of light and energy echoing the precision that had first captured the fleet's attention. Though the monitors were simple compared to the ancient technology they observed, they relayed the beacon's message faithfully, a constant reminder of the intelligence and intention embedded within the structure. Within the fleet's command decks, officers reviewed the latest transmissions with meticulous care. The patterns of the signal had remained unchanged for weeks, yet each repetition offered additional subtle details when analyzed with the full capacity of Imperial instruments. Even minute variations in intensity and timing were logged, as though the ancient builders had embedded layers of information too subtle for casual observation. Mechanicum specialists suggested that the pillar's signal might be part of a much larger system, one designed to communicate not merely across space, but across time itself. Its endurance implied planning on a scale that surpassed human experience. A civilization capable of anticipating centuries of decay, and yet confident that their work would eventually be discovered and understood. The astropaths aboard the fleet reported their own impressions, subtle though persistent. Some sense of faint resonance in the warp, a quiet, ordered vibration that seemed to extend far beyond the immediate vicinity of the planet. Others described impressions of geometric forms stretching across the galaxy, shapes that appeared in moments of meditative focus yet vanished upon closer scrutiny. The signal seemed to echo both in physical space and within the Imperium, its reach extending in ways no single instrument could fully measure. Meanwhile, the command officers began correlating the beacon sequences with star charts, projecting the coordinates along the outer edges of Imperial maps. Slowly, the outlines of a vast network began to emerge. Systems that had previously been considered unremarkable now revealed themselves as potential nodes in a larger design, connected by the mathematical relationships encoded within the pulse of the pillar. What had begun as a simple survey had grown into a puzzle spanning thousands of light years. The repetition of certain coordinates suggested centers of significance, while isolated points hinted at locations yet undiscovered. The Imperium scholars debated endlessly. Were these markers intended for navigation, for storage of knowledge, or for some other purpose now lost to time? One theory, voiced quietly among the Mechanicum adepts, carried both fascination and unease. If the pillar was only one among many, then other monuments might still exist, hidden beneath alien worlds, shielded within dead stars, or buried beneath the crust of uncharted planets. Each would transmit its signal, part of a network extending far beyond the reach of even the greatest fleets of the Crusade. The implications were staggering. Such a system could encompass entire regions of the galaxy, a silent communication spanning millennia, its purpose awaiting only those with the patience and insight to decode it. The fleet's officers acknowledged that they had merely glimpsed the first fragment of a vast and enduring design. Yet for all the complexity, the discovery carried a quiet, almost meditative quality. Unlike other encounters of the Crusade, there was no immediate threat, no battle to be fought, no enemy to confront. Instead, there was an elegance in the patience of the signal, a calm repetition that endured through centuries of silence. It suggested an intelligence that considered time differently, planning across spans far longer than the lifespan of any human endeavor. As the fleet moved steadily toward more familiar sectors of space, the officers convened to discuss the implications. The coordinates recorded from the pillar's transmission would be archived and cross-referenced with other data gathered across the Crusade. Plans were drafted for future expeditions capable of investigating the location suggested by the network. The resources were scarce and the fleet could not linger indefinitely. The decision was made to leave a detailed record with Terra, ensuring that the Emperor's advisors would receive the full account of the discovery. Holo projections, encoded data streams, and astropathic impressions were compiled carefully, preserving every aspect of the pillar's signal and the structures discovered on the surface of the distant world. The Imperium central authorities would determine the significance of the network, deciding which systems warranted further investigation and which might remain unexplored for the present. Above the barren plains, the pillar continued its steady pulse. Its rhythm echoed through the layers of stone and rock, reaching upward into space where no human eye could see. The signal remained unchanged, patient and deliberate, a quiet reminder of the vast intelligence that had created it. For the fleet's crew, the discovery left a lasting impression. It was a glimpse of a galaxy older and more intricate than they had known, a reminder that the Emperor's crusade was but one thread in the tapestry of countless civilizations past. The signal, repeating endlessly, offered guidance yet to be interpreted, a testament to the endurance of thought, planning, and design across unimaginable spans of time. As the ship slipped once more into the warp, leaving the distant system behind, the crews carried with them the memory of the pillar and its network. Somewhere, far beyond the edges of the explored sectors, other nodes of this ancient communication system likely waited, each continuing its silent transmission across the galaxy. The Great Crusade would continue, as it always had, advancing humanity's reach among the stars. Yet in quiet moments, when the Imperium shimmered softly against the hull and the warp currents moved without turbulence, the pulse of the ancient beacon could be felt, whispering its patterns into the consciousness of those attuned to its rhythm, and promising that the galaxy still held mysteries older and greater than any that had yet been revealed. The pillar's light pulsed, and the Imperium, though unaware of its full extent, had begun to listen. The fleet moved steadily through familiar space, its vessels resuming their standard formations as the warp currents carried them toward more secure corridors of the Imperium. Yet, even among the regular duties of exploration, reclamation, and consolidation, the officers and scholars who had witnessed the discovery of the distant world and its buried beacon could not entirely abandon the thought of what they had uncovered. The memory of the pillar beneath the stone plains, its steady pulse, and the intricate sequences of its signal remained vivid, quietly shaping conversations, studies, and decisions alike. A report from Terra had arrived in fragmented form, confirming that the data transmitted to the astropathic relay had been received and catalogued. High-ranking officials of the Mechanicum and the Administratum had begun their analyses, assigning specialists to the sequences of coordinates, the geometric arrangements of the planetary formations, and the symbols engraved on the pillar itself. Every detail had been logged, every subtle variation recorded. It was clear that the Imperium recognized the potential significance of the discovery, though the full meaning had yet to emerge. Among the fleet, discussions turned to the network implied by the beacon transmission. The patterns of repeated coordinates suggested that the distant pillar was merely one node among many, a single point in a design that likely spanned countless star systems. Mechanicum analysts debated the purpose of such a network. Some argued it had been intended for navigation, a guide for travelers through regions of space that were otherwise dangerous or unknown. Others suggested that it might be a repository of knowledge, encoding data across the galaxy so that future civilizations could recover it. There was a quiet consensus, however, that the network's true meaning was still obscured. Its creators had deliberately encoded layers of information, subtle intervals, and variations embedded within the pulse of the beacon, requiring careful study and considerable time to decipher. The endurance of the signal itself was a testament to the sophistication of its builders. It had survived countless millennia beneath the surface of a dead world, and now it continued to transmit faithfully, its purpose preserved across time. Astropaths aboard the fleet noted minor disturbances in the warp, subtle enough to be almost imperceptible, yet persistent. Some described fleeting impressions of geometric forms stretching across vast distances, patterns that seemed to mirror the network suggested by the sequences of the pillar. Others experienced sensations of disquiet, a quiet tension that hinted at forces or intelligences beyond direct perception. While no overt danger was apparent, the psychological effect was undeniable. The discovery was not merely material, but also something that resonated across the Imperium. The fleet's officers recognized the practical limitations imposed by the Great Crusade. Their duty was to continue the expansion of the Imperium, reclaiming worlds, reuniting isolated colonies, and ensuring the Emperor's authority was asserted across countless systems. Yet the beacon, with its patient pulse and the network it suggested, demanded attention. Plans were made to allocate future resources toward the investigation of the distant coordinates encoded within the pillar's signal. Specialized expeditions would be required, vessels equipped with advanced sensors, Mechanicum scholars, and astropathic teams capable of interpreting subtle warp resonances. Even as preparations for eventual follow-up were considered, the fleet continued its current mission. Survey teams cataloged newly explored systems, planetary resources, and remnants of lost civilizations, maintaining the steady expansion of Imperial knowledge. Yet, beneath the routine, a quiet awareness persisted. The discovery of the beacon had revealed a deeper truth about the galaxy. Humanity's understanding of space was incomplete. Civilizations older and more sophisticated than the Imperium itself had existed, leaving structures and signals that endured far longer than any human endeavor. In private quarters, some officers reflected upon the philosophical implications of the discovery. The pillar's pulse suggested a civilization capable of thinking across vast spans of time, capable of creating systems that persisted after their own disappearance. Such endurance implied not only intelligence but also patience and foresight, qualities that human endeavors rarely matched. The network hinted at a galaxy shaped by long-lived designs, patterns that might intersect with the Imperium's own expansion in ways still unperceived. As the fleet passed through another uncharted system, the stars visible through the viewport seemed smaller, yet their presence carried a new weight. Each point of light represented a potential node in the ancient network. Somewhere among them, other pillars and monuments might remain, continuing their quiet transmissions across millennia, awaiting discovery. The realization instilled both fascination and a subtle unease among those who had witnessed the first beacon. The galaxy was not simply vast, it was ancient, layered with knowledge and design that had endured long before humanity's rise. For the fleet's Mechanicum specialists, the task was both technical and philosophical. Their instruments and calculations could record and interpret the signal, yet the human mind alone could grasp only fragments of its meaning. It became evident that the investigation would span generations, requiring patience as deliberate as the creators of the beacon had demonstrated. In some ways, the Imperium had merely caught the first whispers of a message that had traveled across the galaxy for untold ages. In the quiet of the command chambers, officers frequently returned to the imagery of the barren world below, the vast geometric formation stretching across the plains, and the black pillar at its center. Though the fleet had left orbit, the monitoring station continued its wake, preserving the pulse for as long as possible. Its rhythm was a constant reminder. The galaxy held knowledge beyond immediate comprehension, waiting patiently to be revealed. The Great Crusade continued, advancing humanity's reach among the stars. Yet the memory of the pillar and its signal lingered, a quiet presence at the edges of consciousness. Somewhere, beyond the immediate perception of the fleet, other monuments and beacons likely persisted, their transmissions forming a network of silent guidance across the galaxy. And as the stars shifted outside the viewports, and warp currents carried the fleet onward, the thought persisted. Humanity had glimpsed only the beginning of a system older, broader, and more deliberate than the Imperium itself could yet understand. The pillar pulsed, and the galaxy waited in patient silence. The fleet advanced steadily along the established corridors of the Great Crusade, its ships moving in careful formation as the warp currents carried them through familiar and newly charted regions alike. Yet, even as the officers oversaw routine surveys and the reclamation of distant systems, the discovery of the distant world and its buried pillar remained at the forefront of thought. The memory of the beacon's pulse, precise and unyielding, haunted the imaginations of both commanders and mechanicum adepts, urging them to consider a scale of intelligence far beyond human comprehension. Back on Terra, the transmission sent by the expeditionary fleet continued to be studied. Scholars, navigators, and mechanicum magi examined every detail of the beacon's sequences, decoding symbols and cataloging the intervals between pulses. Though the full meaning remained elusive, patterns were becoming apparent. Certain coordinates repeated more frequently than others, forming a structure across the galaxy that suggested careful design and intent. The network was not random. It was deliberate, its reach potentially spanning thousands of light years. Within the fleet, officers discussed the implications. If other nodes existed along the sequence, the Imperium might encounter structures of similar complexity and significance, each transmitting a signal meant to endure across centuries. The beacon was more than a relic. It was a system of communication, a map of hidden knowledge, and perhaps even a guide intended for those capable of understanding. Its purpose, however, remained a matter of speculation. As the fleet traveled, the astropaths aboard reported subtle phenomena within the warp. Echoes of the pillar's pulse seemed to resonate faintly through the immaterium, interacting with the psychic currents in ways that could not be explained by conventional observation. Some described fleeting impressions of geometric forms, vast networks stretching across the galaxy, and the sense of an intelligence carefully orchestrating patterns far larger than the Imperium itself. Though these experiences were subjective, the consistency across multiple astropaths suggested a phenomenon rooted in the beacon's enduring influence. Meanwhile, the fleet maintained the monitoring of the distant system via automated sensors. The pillar beneath the stone plain continued its precise, rhythmic transmissions, unaffected by time or observation. Its pulse persisted through the vacuum of space and the layers of rock that had hidden it for millennia. Every cycle repeated the same intervals and coordinates, a quiet testament to the builder's foresight and deliberate planning. The mechanicum specialists began to focus on the implications of scale. The sequences suggested not only points of interest, but also relationships between those points, as if the beacon had been designed to convey the structure of a network in both space and time. Distances between coordinates appeared encoded within the intervals of the pulses, a subtle mathematical language that described spatial relationships with remarkable precision. The builders had not merely marked locations. They had embedded information about how those locations related to one another, forming a vast framework awaiting interpretation. Officers recorded every observation, noting the potential importance of the network. The Great Crusade relied upon exploration and reclamation, yet here was a discovery that could guide humanity into regions previously uncharted. The knowledge embedded within the beacon might hold keys to resources, safe passages, or even technologies far surpassing current human understanding. And while the fleet could continue its duties, it was clear that further study would be necessary to unlock the full significance of the ancient network. In private chambers, scholars considered the philosophical ramifications. The builders had designed a system meant to endure. Their knowledge persisted across time, encoded in signals that could survive civilizations rising and falling, was waged across countless stars in the expansion of a species that had not yet reached the peak of its own understanding. The beacon was a reminder of the galaxy's vast history and the depth of intelligence that had existed long before the Imperium itself. As the fleet approached another series of uncharted systems, the significance of the pillar's pulse became more pressing. Each new star and planet observed prompted reflections on the hidden coordinates recorded within the sequences. Could some of these systems contain additional nodes of the network? Might civilizations unknown to humanity have already encountered these beacons, shaping their histories in response to signals imperceptible to ordinary senses? Despite the uncertainties, the operation proceeded with disciplined precision. Survey teams cataloged resources, measured stellar phenomena, and ensured that Imperial authority extended into the newly explored regions. Yet, the presence of the network lingered in every discussion, every calculation, and every observation. The subtle awareness of an enduring, intelligent design imbued even routine procedures with a sense of gravity. In the quiet moments between warp jumps, officers often returned to the memory of the barren world and its geometric planes. The pillar's pulse continued its endless rhythm, a silent witness to the passage of time, a signal awaiting comprehension, and a reminder that the galaxy was older, more complex, and more deliberate than the Imperium had yet recognized. As the fleet moved forward, following the measured corridors of the Crusade, the thought persisted among those most attuned to the discovery. The beacon was only the first fragment of a pattern whose entirety remained hidden, scattered across systems waiting to be found. The full network stretched far beyond the fleet's current perception, and the Imperium had only begun to glimpse its edges. The pulse of the pillar continued beneath the silent plains, echoing through millennia of stone, across the void of space, and into the minds of those who listened. And the galaxy, vast and patient, waited to reveal the rest of its ancient design. The fleet moved silently through the warp, the familiar hum of engines resonating softly against the hull, while outside, the stars shimmered faintly through the viewports, their distant light hinting at the immensity of the galaxy yet to be explored. For the officers and scholars aboard the ships, the memory of the distant world, its vast geometric planes, and the hidden pillar beneath the surface remained ever present. Even as the fleet performed its duties in survey, reclamation, and consolidation, the pulse of the ancient beacon lingered in thought, quiet but persistent, reminding them of the scope of the mysteries that lay beyond immediate comprehension. The data transmitted to Terra had been received and analyzed with care. High-ranking Mechanicum adepts, administrators, and astropathic coordinators studied the sequences of coordinates, the precise intervals between pulses, and the symbols etched across the pillar's surface. Each element suggested deliberate encoding, a system of communication designed to endure across time and space. Patterns of repetition, mathematical ratios, and alignment between coordinates implied a network of extraordinary sophistication. Yet its ultimate purpose remained veiled, and the Imperium scholars could only speculate upon the intentions of its creators. The fleet's astropath reported continued resonance within the warp, subtle and persistent, like faint currents echoing from the pillar's pulse. Moments of insight emerged, geometric impressions, suggested networks, and patterns of light that could not be measured by conventional instruments. But these perceptions were fleeting, often dissipating before they could be fully understood. The Imperium, it seemed, had absorbed and reflected the structure of the ancient network, its echoes reaching across the currents of psychic space to those sensitive enough to perceive them. Mechanicum specialists aboard the fleet conducted careful analysis, mapping the known coordinates against established star charts. They projected the sequences onto both physical and warp-link models, seeking to identify points of intersection, hidden alignments, and potential routes between nodes. Each successful alignment suggested that the network's design was not random, but highly ordered. Some points appeared to recur across cycles, indicating nodes of particular importance, while isolated coordinates hinted at locations as yet unobserved by Imperial explorers. The implications weighed heavily upon those charged with oversight. The Great Crusade, though vast in scope, had so far revealed only fragments of the galaxy's full design. The pillar's signal suggested that civilizations older and more deliberate than humanity had once operated across regions now dominated by the Imperium. Their purpose had endured through the ages, embedded in structures and transmissions capable of surviving millennia, waiting patiently for discovery. Scholars considered the broader meaning of such endurance. The beacon was more than a simple navigational aid. It was a system of preservation. It had been built to communicate across spans of time, designed to withstand the rise and fall of civilizations, natural decay, and the turbulence of the cosmos. In this light, The pillar was both message and monument, a deliberate whisper from the distant past, intended to persist until capable observers arose to interpret it. While these considerations unfolded, the fleet continued its operations. Survey teams mapped new systems, assessed planetary resources, and cataloged remnants of lost cultures. Yet beneath the routine wake, an undercurrent of attention persisted. An awareness of the distant beacon and the network it implied were more than curiosities. They were a guide, a framework, and a challenge, hinting at truths far larger than the immediate frontiers of the Crusade. The officers maintained meticulous records, noting the subtle variations in the pillar's sequences. Even minor shifts in timing or intensity were recorded, for they might contain additional layers of information. Every observation suggested the network was structured to convey complexity through repetition, encoding relationships between nodes that were not immediately apparent to casual study. The system was patient, deliberate, and enduring, a design conceived to operate across spans of space and time that dwarfed even the current reach of the Imperium. Among the crew, quiet reflection became common. The pillar's pulse, though remote, evoked a sense of continuity with a galaxy far older than human civilization. Its signal was not urgent, aggressive, or violent. It was methodical, calm, and unyielding, like the steady rhythm of time itself. Observers could not help but consider the patience, foresight, and precision required to create such a system, and the impermanence of humanity's own endeavors in comparison. The network implied by the sequences suggested nodes stretching across unexplored regions, the possibility that other monuments existed, transmitting silently beneath alien worlds, inspired both fascination and caution. These were not mere relics. They were functioning elements of an intelligence that had long vanished from the stars. The Imperium, despite its technological and psychic reach, had only glimpsed the first fragment of an order that spanned light years and ages alike. As the fleet continued, the stars outside the viewports reminded the crew of the galaxy's vastness. Every distant sun might conceal another node, every uncharted system a continuation of the network. The beacon beneath the stone plains remained undisturbed, continuing its steady pulse, a quiet signal transmitting patiently across time and space, awaiting those capable of discerning its full meaning. Even as the fleet moved onward, the thought persisted among the Mechanicum specialists and the officers. The network was ancient, deliberate, and enduring. Humanity had observed only its first echoes, and the galaxy held countless further mysteries of similar scale, patiently waiting for discovery. The pulse of the distant pillar continued, and the silent web of coordinates stretched across the stars, unseen but complete, holding secrets older than human memory and awaiting those with the patience to perceive them. The fleet moved through the warp once more, the familiar hum of the engines resonating against the hull as it carried the vessel steadily along the established routes of the Great Crusade. Beyond the viewports, the stars of distant systems shimmered faintly, their light passing through the veil of the Imperium and into the consciousness of those aboard. For many officers and scholars, the memory of the distant world and the pillar buried beneath its plains remained vivid, quietly shaping each decision, every observation, and all considerations of strategy or navigation. The pulse of the ancient beacon lingered in thought, a constant reminder of intelligence far beyond immediate human comprehension. Back on Terra, the Imperium's Mechanicum scholars continued their analysis of the sequences transmitted from the expeditionary fleet. The coordinates, intervals, and patterns etched into the pillar's pulse were studied with meticulous care, layer upon layer of interpretation applied to each subtle variation. The repetition of specific locations suggested points of particular significance, while isolated sequences hinted at nodes yet undiscovered. Every measure reinforced the idea that the network was deliberate, precise, and designed to endure across centuries and across space. Within the fleet, astropaths reported continued resonance in the warp. The pulse of the distant beacon seemed to extend through psychic currents, creating faint impressions of geometry, repetition, and connectivity that could not be measured by conventional instruments. Some reported fleeting visions of lines stretching across light years, connecting points in ways that suggested an intelligence both deliberate and patient. Others sensed tension within these currents, subtle disturbances hinting at forces or structures not yet revealed to humanity. The signal was more than information. It was presence, subtle yet undeniable. Mechanicum specialists projected the sequences onto both physical and warp-linked charts, tracing alignment between known stars and the coordinates recorded from the pillar. Slowly, a framework emerged, a vast, interconnected network stretching far beyond the immediate sectors of the Crusade. Certain points recurred in multiple sequences, suggesting centers of significance or focal nodes within the design. Others appeared only once, as if marking peripheral systems or locations still waiting to be observed. The network hinted at an order that could guide navigation, preserve knowledge, or convey purpose across vast reaches of time and space. The weight of these revelations settled upon the fleet's officers. The Great Crusade advanced with urgency and precision, yet here was a discovery that challenged the very scale of their understanding. The network suggested civilizations older and more deliberate than humanity, whose knowledge had endured long after the fall of their worlds. Structures like the pillar were not relics but active transmitters, designed to continue their function regardless of who observed them, or whether anyone observed them at all. In private quarters, scholars contemplated the implications. The pillar's pulse was methodical, deliberate, and patient. Unlike the Imperium's fleet, which operated under schedules and tactical necessity, the network had no need for haste. It endured across millennia, surviving the rise and fall of civilizations and remaining functional in isolation. Its persistence was a lesson in patience and precision, a reminder that intelligence could operate on scales far larger than those of humanity. Meanwhile, the fleet continued its operations, surveying new systems, cataloging resources, and reclaiming worlds previously isolated from Imperial control. Yet the pulse of the pillar remained a constant presence in thought, a subtle guiding rhythm beneath the work of conquest and administration. Officers frequently returned to the memory of the barren world, its geometric planes, and the black pillar at the center, contemplating the full network of which it was only a part. Mechanicum specialists carefully logged each slight variation in the pulse, noting intervals, sequences, and the mathematical relationships encoded within them. Even minor shifts were significant, suggesting layers of meaning yet to be decoded. Each repetition carried more than coordinates. It encoded relationships, spatial alignments, and possibly purposes that transcended simple observation. The network was designed not merely to convey information, but to endure, to guide, and perhaps to instruct across the uncounted years since its creation. Astropaths reported faint impressions of distant forms, shadows of the network echoing through the warp. These perceptions were subtle and often fleeting, yet consistent among multiple observers. Some sensed connections stretching across vast distances, linking nodes that had not yet been physically explored. Others felt the weight of purpose embedded within the signals, as if the network itself were aware of the observers studying it. The beacon, though unmoving and silent to the eye, had left its mark upon the Imperium. In the quiet moments between warp transitions, officers meditated upon the meaning of the discovery. The network, so deliberate and enduring, suggested that the galaxy held knowledge far older than humanity's own memory. The pillar's pulse, precise and unyielding, was but one fragment, its rhythm repeating endlessly beneath stone, sending sequences across light years, waiting for those patient enough to follow its pattern. As the fleet moved steadily onward, a new understanding emerged. The Imperium had glimpsed only the beginnings of a system of intelligence older and more deliberate than its own reach. The pulse beneath the distant plains continued, steady and precise, echoing across the void, and the galaxy itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the network to reveal its remaining secrets. The pillar's light pulsed through the darkness, and the hidden web of coordinates stretched silently across the stars, patient, unyielding, and vast beyond comprehension. The fleet continued its journey through the warp, the familiar vibration of engines and hum of the ship's hulls creating a quiet rhythm within the command decks. Though the outward mission of exploration, reclamation, and consolidation proceeded without interruption, the thoughts of officers, mechanicum specialists, and astropaths were often drawn back to the distant world and the pillar hidden beneath its stone plains. Its pulse, steady and deliberate, had imprinted itself upon their consciousness, a subtle yet unrelenting reminder of intelligence far older and more patient than humanity itself. Reports continued to arrive from the monitoring station, left behind on the distant world. Automated sensors relayed the pillar's unchanging rhythm, the sequences of coordinates, and subtle fluctuations in the transmission. Even across the vast distance, these data streams revealed meticulous order. Intervals repeated with mathematical precision, sequences maintained without deviation, and the pattern of the signal suggested an intent far beyond casual design. Each pulse was a fragment of a broader system, its purpose yet to be fully discerned. On board the fleet, mechanicum specialists and officers worked tirelessly to interpret these transmissions. Models were created to represent the spatial relationships implied by the sequences. Projections across both physical and warp-link charts began to reveal alignment between known and potential nodes, forming the faint outline of a vast and interconnected network. Certain coordinates appeared repeatedly, as if emphasizing centers of importance, while isolated points suggested locations yet to be explored. Slowly, a pattern emerged, a structure deliberate in design and persistent across space and time. Astropath aboard the fleet continued to report impressions within the Imperium. Though faint and often fleeting, these psychic echoes suggested forms stretching across light years, linking points in ways imperceptible to instruments yet tangible to perception. Some described geometric patterns, others a sense of guidance or purpose, subtle yet insistent. The network of the ancient builders seemed to extend into the warp itself, embedding a resonance that interacted with the psychic currents in ways the Imperium scholars had yet to fully comprehend. Despite the operational demands of the Crusade, the fleet's command officers recognized the significance of these observations. The Great Crusade advanced with speed and precision, yet here was a discovery capable of redirecting priorities, shaping future expeditions, and influencing the long-term strategy of imperial expansion. The network of nodes suggested the presence of civilizations far older and more deliberate than humanity, civilizations whose knowledge had been encoded to survive millennia, transmitting patiently until rediscovered. The philosophical implications weighed heavily upon the fleet. Unlike the fleets of the Imperium, which operated under schedules, tactical necessity, and the urgency of conquest, the network had been conceived to endure, to function across centuries without intervention. Its design was deliberate, its intentions silent yet persistent. Observers could grasp only fragments, hints of the structure and purpose embedded within its sequences, yet those fragments were sufficient to reveal a scale of intelligence far beyond current human comprehension. In quiet moments, scholars and officers considered the potential implications for the Imperium. The network could guide exploration into regions previously uncharted, provide knowledge of lost technologies or civilizations, and reveal safe passages through sectors previously deemed hazardous. It suggested the existence of monuments, beacons, or structures hidden beneath alien worlds, waiting for patient observation to interpret their meaning. The network was not merely information, it was endurance itself, a record of thought that had survived across millennia. As the fleet moved through uncharted systems, the officers frequently returned to memory of the barren world, its geometric planes, and the black pillar at the center. The pulse beneath the surface remained unbroken, its rhythm precise, its message patient. Each repetition carried not only coordinates but also relationships, intervals, and intent, forming a network that could guide understanding for those capable of perceiving it. The galaxy, in all its immensity, seemed to hum quietly in response to the enduring transmission. Within the warp, astropaths noted faint but consistent echoes of the network. Patterns of light, geometry, and resonance appeared in fleeting impressions, vanishing as quickly as they manifested. Yet even these brief glimpses reinforced a growing understanding. The network was deliberate, its design deliberate, and its reach extensive. Humanity had uncovered only the first threads, and the Imperium's comprehension remained nascent. The fleet's officers documented each observation meticulously, creating archives to accompany future expeditions capable of following the network to its other nodes. Every slight variation in the pulse was recorded, every coordinate cross-referenced with known systems, and every pattern noted for study. The work required patience, discipline, and precision, yet the reward promised insight into the hidden architecture of the galaxy. And yet, despite the diligence, much remained unknown. The network was ancient, its builders long gone, its purpose largely obscured. Its pulse persisted across millennia, a signal of enduring intelligence, awaiting discovery by those who would follow its pattern and interpret its message. The fleet pressed onward, advancing humanity's reach among the stars, while the pillar beneath the distant plains continued its endless pulse, transmitting sequences of coordinates, intervals, and meaning. The network stretched across the galaxy, silent and patient, waiting for comprehension, its rhythm steady and unyielding, echoing across space and time. The beacon pulsed, and the galaxy held its quiet, deliberate secrets, offering only glimpses of a design far older and more vast than the Imperium had yet begun to understand.